Hey, Jill, just to make sure I've got this right, about how long into the beginning of this before Senator Salomon will be speaking?
I'm guessing about 7 minutes.
Okay, that was kind of what I was thinking, so I just want to make sure. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks, John. And Amelia, just to confirm, is Councilman Erickson going to be joining us separately? Or there he is, I see you. Hello, Councilman Erickson. All right. Just waiting for Jason, and then I think we can get going in a couple minutes. Hello, Senator.
Hey, Jill, did you see the message from Councilman Erickson in the chat?
I'm on it right now, Ephraim. Thanks for flagging.
Well, I was like, nope, definitely didn't.
Yeah, just trying to get the info copied and pasted into the chat.
Thank you. Oops, going backwards.
Are we just going to have Congressman Huffman frozen there on screen the whole time?
I know, right? He's with us all the time. All right. There we go. We have everybody lined up, I believe. So let's get rolling. Good morning, everyone. I guess afternoon for those of you joining us on the East Coast. My name is Jill Weitz. I am the director of Salmon Beyond Borders. I'm calling in today from Tlingit, which is the traditional lands of the Tlingit people from Juneau, Alaska, nestled within the Tongass National Forest. Salmon Beyond Borders is a community-driven campaign. We work really closely with commercial and sport fishermen, community leaders, tourism and recreation business owners, and concerned citizens in collaboration with tribes and First Nations, united across the Alaska-BC border to defend and sustain our transboundary rivers, jobs, and our salmon way of life. I'm grateful that you have joined us today, and we are excited to share with you our distinguished guests in what is the second series of events we have co-hosted with the Congressional Wild Salmon Caucus. But before we dive in, I'd like to introduce you to my co-moderator and dear friend, Ephraim Froehlich of AKWA-DC.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate it. My name is Ephraim Froehlich, as Jill said. I'm a born and raised Alaskan, and I worked in Washington, D.C. on natural resource policy for close to a decade before moving home to Alaska to do the same. I'm currently located in Seattle on Duwamish land, and I'm a policy consultant at AKWA-DC, like Jill said, advising stakeholders on fisheries and environmental policy from Alaska and Washington State to Washington, D.C. As an Alaskan, I am pleased to introduce our next speaker specifically. He has been an Alaskan celebrity for my entire life. We are really lucky to have the Congressman for all Alaska with us here live on Zoom today. Congressman Don Young is a co-chair of the Wild Salmon Caucus who's hosting this briefing, so thank you very much for that, Congressman, and has been dedicated to transboundary mining issues on behalf of Alaskans for as long as I've been aware of these issues. His tireless work has directly led engagement with Canada and has directed appropriation spending to create and facilitate the interagency working group on transboundary mining. Congressman Young, the floor is yours, and we're really happy to have you here today.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I really appreciate this seminar. This is something that's dear to my heart, as you well know. Wild salmon, cross borders, a whole bit, and salmon, of course, is Alaska's trademark. They say ptarmigan is our national bird, but the salmon is our national fish. And I am very proud of the fact that I've been working very hard to try to make sure that we have an abundance of wild salmon across the states, Washington, Oregon, and I won't say California. Huffman from California has to be careful about that. But even California, but most of all, Alaska. We have a lot of challenges, of course, across the borders. You know, and I know the Clayton Hyde of our great state have been working for years to make sure that we have proper mining in Canada. And I believe I talked to the ambassador from Canada yesterday. I do think there is a willingness to try to make sure we have positive protection over a long run, making sure that the mining that takes place on rivers that go into Alaskan waters and Washington waters are done safely and I call with the highest deal of cooperation between ourselves and Canada, monitoring the water quality. NOAA's been helping me on this and making sure we have the project done well. I would suggest respectfully, we can't say we're anti-mining. What we're for is what we call safe mining. And I believe it can be done. It's a requirement setting up, it can be done, and we should continue to work for that. We have another challenge, of course, with our salmon, and people don't like me to mention this, but we have climate change, we have predators, which we have not, right, frankly, addressed because it's really not popular. We have the concept of, you know, what's happening in our oceans. I'm very much, you know, we have a tendency to look onshore as we're doing with the mining, but I think we ought to really look at our oceans. The El Nino is the difference, the acidification, frankly, the trash. We have to look at that to make sure we retain the wild salmon concept for all our states that are involved. I am very adamantly opposed to introduce legislation, have got good support of what we call farm-raised salmon within our waters. Of course, I know some of our states have been involved in this, but I want them out of Alaska for sure, because our biggest trademark is wild Alaskan salmon. I want to make sure they continue to do that. Some people say, well, we're not talking about salmon. We're involved in just finfish and not salmon. And I'm saying, you don't understand. Once you put in a fish farm, even if for halibut or pollock or whatever they're talking about, this is NOAA, by the way, this is our government. I'm saying you will contaminate our salmon. And I think that's inappropriate. And if they want to do this in the Gulf of Mexico, fine. But stay out of my waters is what I'm trying to say. So again, you have some great speakers today and people that are really interested in this project across the borders, waters for our salmon. And let's get something done together. And just a little bit of fatherly advice. I'm the oldest one of this whole bunch. Let's not holler at one another. Let's say, what can we do? I'm talking about Canada and the United States. They're under real stress now for other reasons. I'm talking to them about cruise industry. I'm talking about mining. I'm talking about trade. This is something a lot of people don't understand. They're directly involved, and politically now we have a lot of people. Let's buy America. I'm all for buying America, but it should be let's buy North America. That's Canada, our United States, and even Mexico. Let's do this together as a joint effort. And everybody says, what's that got to do with salmon? It's all tied together. And I always argue communication solves problems. Hollering does not. And hate creates problems. Love does not. So I'm saying, you know, to all of you on this conference, enjoy yourselves. I understand the chairman, Mr. Huffman, is going to be speaking later on. And as you know, we're working on the Magnuson Act, and we're hoping to get togetherness. I'm a little irritated with you now, Mr. Huffman, because you gave Congressman Case from Hawaii credit for what you and I are trying to do, and I'm going to get you when I get back to Washington, D.C. But anyway, guys, thank you very much for what you're doing. Let's save our salmon. Let's have them available in quantity that's necessary commercially and sport. We can do it together. Let's watch what we're doing across the borders. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Congressman Young. We truly appreciate you, your continued support and dedication, not only on this issue, but for wild salmon. And to your point, we are, if anything, we are pro salmon, and that's what we're here to do, and we got to do it together. So thank you so much. Thank you for co-hosting this event. We appreciate you. All right. I am pleased to virtually introduce to you all Congressman Jared Huffman, who represents the 2nd District of California, who is a champion for wild salmon and who is let me make sure I can do this correctly, who is the co-chair of the Congressional Wild Salmon Caucus. He has shared with us pre-recorded remarks that I'm going to play for you now.
Thank you for joining this important briefing today. It's great to be here virtually with my colleague and Wild Salmon Caucus co-chair, Congressman Don Young, to talk about transboundary issues facing wild salmon. And for those of you who don't know me, I represent California's 2nd District, which spans the entire north coast of the state from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. I serve as chair of the Natural Resource Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. And in my district and throughout the Pacific Northwest, of course, salmon have great ecological, cultural, and economic importance. They're also a way of life for many of the people I represent. Tribes in my district have depended on salmon since time immemorial. Of course, commercial fishermen rely on healthy fisheries for their livelihoods, and I've got a lot of recreational anglers who, like me, love to spend their free time on the water casting for salmon. But as much as I think we should always celebrate wild salmon, we should continue working on the threats to wild salmon as well. And that includes everything from climate change to habitat loss. That's why I have led the Salmon Fish Act legislation that would protect and restore the best habitats so that they can support thriving wild salmon, as well as the communities and the economies that depend on them. Restoring struggling salmon populations, as well as protecting healthy ones, and then also maintaining high quality habitat. All of these are critical to ensuring a future for wild salmon. Tackling existing and potential transboundary pollution is another key piece of this. The impacts of mining practices in British Columbia are not strictly siloed in Canada, and the United States and Canada have to work together to sustain thriving salmon populations. So thank you to our speakers for being here today. I hope we can all learn more about how to tackle this important issue.
Well, thank you very much to Congressman Huffman and to Congressman Young and to their staffs for hosting this event as the Wild Salmon Caucus. And next, we're going to move out to Washington State, where we have Senator Salomon joining us. Senator Salomon represents the 32nd Legislative District in North Seattle, so just above me, north. I'm in Magnolia. And he has taken a strong leadership role to address transboundary mining issues between Washington State and British Columbia. Senator Salomon is an advocate for the environment, especially through his role in the Natural Resources Committee. And he recently led a letter from Washington State lawmakers to Premier Horgan on transboundary mining concerns. And that's the most recent letter on the record that we have domestically to Canada. And so I think it's really valuable and important to have Senator Salomon here today to speak. And thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule down in Olympia, sir.
Thank you, Ephraim. I'm really happy to be here. The issue of salmon recovery is near and dear to my heart. I've been caught by the fishing bug since I was 9 years old. And as I grew older, the boats that I've owned have grown larger and larger. They're now up to 23 feet. I have 2 in my driveway, need to get rid of 1. I represent the, like Congressman Young, the whole part of a small state. I'm not saying that right. Did not roll out that joke correctly. So anyways, I'm the vice chair of Agriculture and Natural Resources. We are investing as a state a lot of money into salmon restoration in the Skagit River and other rivers that have in Columbia, where headwaters start in British Columbia. And so it's critical as we do that, as we rehabilitate our estuaries, as we, as Congressman Young said, try to deal with our predator problem, right? We're finally removing pinnipeds from the Columbia River. They've been a huge issue. So we're able to do that. And I thank Congressman Young for any authorization that he's helped us with on that. But just the notion of having a big pollutant come down the river and wiping out all of that is quite scary. I'm proud to say that as soon as I hop off here, I'm going to vote on the Climate Commitment Act. I'm going to vote for a cap and trade program so we can start addressing the climate change. I'm glad Alaska is tackling that too. we're doing so much. So it's so critical that we work in partnership and not allow one accident to wipe out for decades everything that we've been doing. And I'll note that the salmon that are born in Skagit River and Columbia River and other rivers often go north and are caught off Canada. So everything we do affects each other. And so we do need to work in partnership. And I look forward to working with the British Columbia government as much as we can.
Thank you, Senator Salomon. Thank you for your leadership on this issue, and thank you for your time today and for your upcoming vote. That's really exciting. Okay, zooming in, I know we have a lot of great panelists, but Ephraim and I are gonna take a minute to bring you all kind of setting the scene, if you will. As I said, I'm joining you from Alaska, where Salmon Beyond Borders has focused the majority of our efforts to defend and sustain the transboundary Taku, Stikine, and Unic watersheds. These are the largest salmon producing rivers in Southeast Alaska. You'll hear more about them throughout the course of this webinar. And at the headwaters of these rivers that have served as centers of culture and commerce for generations, British Columbia has more than a dozen large-scale open pit mines in various stages of development, ranging from abandonment to exploration, development, and full operation. The industrialization at the headwaters of these salmon rivers is the largest threat to some of these last remaining wild salmon rivers left on the planet. And BC's archaic mining laws are not strong enough to protect water quality, human health, or the environment. And this issue is not unique to the shared salmon rivers of the North. We're seeing this issue replicate itself among international rivers that originate in BC and flow into Washington, as you heard from Senator Salomon, Idaho, and Montana. While we embark on paths toward renewed commitments from the Biden and Trudeau administrations, as Congressman Young alluded to, we will continue to hit a dead end if mining regulations in BC are not strengthened to ensure that mining is done responsibly and that the mining sector is held to account where the liability is placed on the industry and not borne by downstream communities. I will end on this note. Thousands of hardworking Alaskans have called upon the Department of State to secure binding protections, including financial assurances, for years. In an October 2018 letter to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Alaska Governor Walker and the Alaska Congressional Delegation wrote, "We specifically request that the Department of State representatives impress upon their Canadian counterparts the critical need for binding protections, joint water quality monitoring, and financial assurances to protect Americans downstream of large-scale Canadian mines." Ephraim, I kick it to you.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate it. And I'll try to be fast here because we have some awesome people on this panel. As I mentioned, I grew up in Juneau, Alaska on Tlingit land, just a few miles from the mouth of the Taku River, a river that's been polluted by acid mine drainage from BC for decades. A few years after I moved to DC, the Mount Polley mine tailings dam failed in BC's Fraser watershed. That disaster catapulted BC's transboundary mining practices to the forefront of Alaskan policy, and really is where I started engaging on this issue. And that year, the Alaska Congressional Delegation and the Alaska state government began really a pen pal letter writing campaign that is still existing today to the British Columbia government, to Ottawa, and to our federal government, the White House and the State Department. It also really began a process led by Salmon Beyond Borders and Jill's team in Alaska and groups in Washington, Idaho, and Montana to work toward federal appropriations. In 2016, the 4 state congressional delegations successfully got funding for stream gauges on our side of the border, for water quality monitoring to have baseline water quality data. And since then, we've achieved 5 years of funding and even expanded the programs from just USGS to the State Department and the EPA and an interagency working group. That work is ongoing and needs more support, so from all of you. And also in 2019, the 8 senators from Alaska, Idaho, Montana, and Washington wrote to Premier Horgan addressing, the concerns on our side of the border. It was a remarkable policy landmark highlighting the multi-state importance of this issue and really the federal need for engagement. In all of the work over the better part of the last decade, one part of the request that has been a constant from our side of the border is financial assurances. And that is what we're here to discuss today with experts and stakeholders on our side of the border. I'm really excited to hand the mic over to them and to hear about, the next steps and what is needed on our side of the border. But I'll quickly pass it back to Jill.
Thank you, Ephraim. Thank you for your time and dedication to this issue. Now I'd like to introduce you to our first panelist, Dr. David Chambers, who is the founder and president of the Center for Science and Public Participation, which is an invaluable resource for communities throughout the world. Dr. Dave.
Thank you, Jill. Everyone knows what tailings dam failures are, so I don't really need to talk about that. What I'd like to do today is talk about some basics and answer 3 questions for you. Those questions are, what are the types of financial assurances for mining? Why are those financial assurances necessary? And why is requiring a financial assurance good public policy? So back to the first one. What are the types of financial assurances for mining? There are 2 types. The first is a financial assurance for reclamation and closure. And when most of us talk about financial assurances, that's the one we're talking about. What that is a financial assurance for what are generally called reasonably foreseeable events. That is mine closure activities, water treatment. Those are the 2 main things. Now, the good news is that regulators and industry generally today recognize the need for this requirement in most, but not all, regulatory jurisdictions. And they do a fairly good job with it. But we do have leaders, we do have average performers, and we do have jurisdictions that haven't quite caught up yet. The second type of financial assurance is a financial assurance for catastrophic accident, like a tailings dam failure. Presently, those financial assurances today are unfortunately provided by the taxpayer, because basically what we're doing from a policy standpoint is to treat these failures as acts of God. Now, why are these financial assurances necessary? For reclamation and closure, companies go bankrupt. And lots of mines close with a need for perpetual water treatment. And both of these activities cost tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. And unfortunately, there are all too many examples of companies going bankrupt before a mine has been closed. And long-term perpetual water treatment that hasn't been adequately funded. So again, most regulatory jurisdictions understand the need for this, and the inadequacies today are generally associated with how those amounts are calculated, and then how the form of the financial assurance itself, how that's provided. For catastrophic accidents, like I mentioned, unfortunately, they're treated as acts of God, which basically means that the public and taxpayers have to make up the difference if a company itself can't pay that amount. And Mount Poly is a really good example of this. There was no financial assurance for that failure. The company had limited resources, so a majority of the money that went into what little restoration was provided for that accident came from the public itself. A third reason that we need these financial assurances is just to provide equity and fairness. The public, I would argue, shouldn't be put to risk for these accidents. And other economic sectors, for example, the oil and gas industry and the nuclear industry, they are required to provide those financial assurances. They're doing so, and they're prospering. Mining doesn't have to provide these, and that's not fair. That's not equitable. Then finally, why is financial assurance good public policy? Well, one, obviously, it protects the public and protects taxpayers. Secondly, I will argue that it also provides an incentive for mining companies to do the right thing. That is, an incentive to put safety before profits and to encourage building safe tailings dams, because you don't have to pay an insurance policy for a dam that isn't going to fail, or more realistically, your policy is going to be smaller. So that provides an insurance for an incentive for these companies to do the right thing. Unfortunately, what we see right now is that there's an incentive to build the least costly dam, not to build the safest dam. And I think from a public policy standpoint, that's what we want to change. So those are my 3 questions and the answers. I can talk at too much length about Mount Poly failure, about mine closures like the Tulsa-Qua Chief, which are all relative to this discussion. Be happy to answer any questions at some point, but I will close it there. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Dr. Dave. Appreciate your brain as always. Next, it is my honor to introduce you to Councilman Jared Erickson of the Colville Confederated Tribes Business Council, who also serves as the chairman of the Natural Resource and Fisheries Committee. And Councilman Erickson, I'm going to share my screen with your slide. You should be ready to rock and roll.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, I just want to make sure. Last time I was on one of these calls, they didn't wait till the end until they said they couldn't hear me very well, and after I spoke the whole time, so I want to make sure. All right, so first I'll introduce myself. I'm Jared Michael Erickson. It's my name. In our way, we usually introduce who our parents are and grandparents. So my parents are Jim and Karen Erickson. My grandparents on my mom's side are Donald and Betty Barnaby. I come from the Okanagan, Arrow Lakes, and Colville, which are all transboundary tribes, as you'll see on the map there. I go back to Chief Tenasket of the Okanagan and Chief Barnaby of the Colville. They're my three great grandparents. So that's a little about me. I'm like Jill mentioned, I'm our natural resource and fisheries chairman for the Colville Confederated Tribes. I'm also the Upper Columbia United Tribes chairman. I guess I'll start off first. The map that's displayed on the screen right now. The Colville Confederate Tribes is a confederacy of 12 tribes, which has extensive and diverse international homelands stretching about 39 million acres throughout the portions of present-day British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. The creation of the 49th parallel between the U.S. and Canada divided the lands of several indigenous nations, including our constituent tribes of the Okanagan, Arrow Lakes, and Colville. Like I mentioned, we still, in my opinion, don't recognize that boundary. It's just, was put in place with no consultation with us as the tribes. In BC, the homelands we share with our tribal and First Nation relatives and allies extend from Kootenay Lake west to EC Manning Provincial Park in North Demerit, Salmon Arm, and Mount Griffin Ecological Reserve. The headwaters of multiple rivers originate in BC and flow into Washington State through the transboundary traditional territory and lands of the Colville tribes, the Columbia, the Okanagan, Kettle, and the Similkameen rivers. I kind of do want to touch a little before I move on about some of the efforts. I know a lot of our congressmen and senators are outdoorsmen or fishermen. We've been working a lot on getting reintroduction above Grand Coulee Dam. This last year was the first time in 80 years we actually had salmon spawn in the Sampoil River and in Rufus Woods above Chief Joseph Dam. So that was a big success, and any support from anyone we can get on those efforts would be great. it's what I do almost daily is work on, we're working on legislation, a bunch of other things for some of the new stimulus coming up, but it's a lot of work. And again, that's a transboundary river that once they get past Grand Coulee, they will be in Canada again. And then I know with those dams, they have to address, once a fish nose can touch one of those dams, they kind of have to address introduction. So that's exciting. I know our First Nations relatives to the north are excited about that. So next slide, can move on to the, please. So there's a picture of some of our foods and our medicines. Collectively, our Indigenous people have been caretakers of the lands and waters throughout the region since time immemorial. Our ancestors relied heavily upon this diverse ecosystem for survival, sustenance, transportation, health, culture, and community, just as we do today. Our cultural, continually physical, and spiritual health is dependent upon access to and the availability of a resilient and functioning ecosystem rich with diversity. These are just some that we medicines that we collect and first foods that are, we put the salmon on there because obviously we rely heavily on the salmon, not only now just for food, but traditionally for our economy as well. Tribes from everywhere gathered at Kettle Falls. You all probably know or heard of Kettle Falls and the importance that it has. And same with the Okanagan with the Similkameen. There's Coyote Falls right below Enlow Dam. Was a spot we, a lot of our people gathered and caught salmon, and we've spent millions of dollars with our BPA funding to get sockeye back into the Okanagan. And that's also, one of the transboundary that flows up in Soyuz Lake and up into Canada. I know the First Nations have been very happy with those fish getting back up into their waters. And so, again, our Okanagan tribe, our territory extends up into Canada there too as well. So we spent millions and millions of dollars trying to get salmon back, and we need clean water to sustain these our fisheries. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Which I think is, yes. So here's just a map of some transboundary BC mining threats. Mining interests have impacted the traditional territories of the CTCR since immigrants came into the region in the mid-1850s, and began appropriating our lands, waters, and resources. Like our tribal and First Nation friends and relatives, we have been defending our homelands and resources from mining for over a century. For decades, the Colville tribes have led the way in investigating industrial pollution in the Upper Columbia River, specifically the section of the river between Grand Coulee Dam and the US-Canadian border, resulting with a significant lawsuit against Tecumseh for their smelter activities in Trail, British Columbia. I do want to point out, obviously, the smelter and the Copper Mountain mine are different, but also similar. As they talk about the tailings dam failure that was just recently talked about, that happened in 2014, I believe that was. You've seen the devastation from that. Obviously, the height of this new tailings dam is projected to be higher than the Hoover Dam. I believe at 853 feet is what the new tailings dam is projected to be at, which is also higher already than currently than the Grand Coulee Dam, which is where I live next to. The Colville tribes has also opposed mining on the reservation within our traditional territories. We have supported the litigation brought forth by the Okanagan Highland Alliance against the Buckhorn Gold Mine, which is located within the former north half of the reservation and in the Sampoil River watershed. Within 50 miles of the U.S. border, at least 14 mining projects in BC have the potential to negatively impact the transboundary watersheds of our homelands. This includes the Copper Mountain Mine, which has a tailings dam currently standing at 605 feet. Like I mentioned, it's higher than Grand Coulee. The Copper Mountain Mine is proposed for expansion, and if approved, the tailings dam would then be 853 feet, which is also higher than the Hoover Dam and the Space Needle, just for some comparisons so people get an idea of how big this will be. I think that's it for slides, but in closing, I'd like to state that the CCT has been coordinating with First Nations, federally recognized tribes, and environmental organizations like Salmon Beyond Borders to raise awareness of these significant issues. And we are working with First Nations to help them develop their own water quality standards. I know we've had some talks, and Amelia's been on those, that we've been trying to encourage First Nations to really update their water quality standards, and working on how we can help to use some of ours or ways to actually strengthen their water quality standards. So it's important for us to recognize that this is not a question of what mine will pollute or contaminate waters, or who owns it or regulates it, or even where engineering failures will occur. This is not an if-then hypothetical question. It is a when and how problem we must begin solving now. The CCT has been coping with legacy pollution in the upper Columbia River from Tecumseh. The upper and lower Similkameen Indian bands of BC have witnessed visible changes in surface water quality, composition from algae, and changes in the health of various aquatic species of cultural and ecological significance. Moving forward, stronger regulations and financial assurances that have kind of been already stated, implementing the precautionary principle and consistent with water quality standards for transboundary watersheds is needed. Again, this is an issue that's near and dear to me. I don't know if everyone probably had followed DAPL, you know, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and what they were fighting for there. And you know, water is life, and we need to protect that and make sure we have clean drinking water, not for us, but we always say 7 generations in the future, and making sure that we have for my kids, my grandkids, and for everyone, not just us as tribes, but for everyone. So thank you for letting me speak. Hope I wasn't too long, and I hope I got some good information for you guys, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilman Erickson. Yes, thank you. Really compelling every time I see those maps and just learn more about what the Colville Confederated Tribes have been working on. I'm really grateful for all that you're doing. Next, I would like to introduce you to Francis Leach, who is a lifelong Alaskan and executive director of the United Fishermen of Alaska. And Francis, I believe you are sharing your screen, correct?
Yes, I'm going to do that right now. Hopefully. Okay, and from the beginning. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Good morning. My name is Francis Leach, and I'm the Executive Director of United Fishermen of Alaska. Jill asked me to provide a commercial fishing perspective about what the risks are today and what needs protecting. I'm coming live to you from Quinkanaani, Juneau, Alaska, where currently we are experiencing a snowstorm outside my window. The organization that I represent, United Fishermen of Alaska, is the statewide commercial fishing trade organization, representing 37 commercial fishing organizations, as well as over 500 individual UFA members that participate in fisheries around the state and in federal waters of Alaska. We work hard to promote and protect the common interests of Alaska's commercial fishing industry as a vital component of Alaska's social and economic well-being. 11 of UFA's member organizations represent fishermen who fish for salmon, shrimp, and other species in the waters of Southeast Alaska. You can see I've highlighted that area in red on your map. Southeast Alaska fishermen employ hand troll, power troll, drift net, purse seine, longline, pots, and dive gear to harvest our catches in Southeast waters. UFA is increasingly concerned with the potential impacts to fish habitat and water resources from at least 12 large-scale mines, open pit and underground metal mines in British Columbia that are abandoned, permitted, or operating in the headwaters of transboundary rivers that flow downstream into Southeast Alaska, some of which are rivaling the size of the proposed Pebble mine in Bristol Bay. The transboundary Taku, Stikine, Iskut, and Unuknas are world-class salmon producing rivers, contributing $48 million to the Alaska economy and producing 80% of Southeast Alaska's king salmon. The health and productivity of these rivers are integral to the overall $1 billion annual salmon fishing industry and the $1 billion annual tourism industry in Southeast Alaska. In 1957, Teck Resources abandoned the Tulsaka Chief Mine in the Taku River watershed, which is just 33.5 miles, or 55 as the salmon swims, from our capital city and my hometown of Juneau. You can't look at the image on this slide and not be convinced that the damage caused by the abandoned Tulsaka Chief Mine had a direct impact on the wild salmon that inhabited this river. Commercial fishermen in our community have been up in arms about this project for more than 60 years. And it's because of BC's laws, this mine site has been leaching acid mine drainage into our largest salmon river in Southeast Alaska. This year, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game will list this Taku, Stikine, and Unuk king salmon runs as stock of concerns. We are continuing to see the impacts and devastation. The best way to avoid the loss of livelihoods and cultural ways of life is for them not to be lost in the first place. The state of Alaska have previously requested that BC require companies operating mines within transboundary watersheds to post a full reclamation bond prior to permitting, as the state of Alaska requires. UFA continues to support this request to ensure that state resources are not harmed by Canadian large-scale mining development in the headwaters of transboundary salmon rivers. We ask that this work continue and that this important message is carried forward by members of Congress for all future engagements with the Biden administration and its Department of State, and with lawmakers of British Columbia and Canada. And with that, I thank you and turn it back over to Jill.
Thank you so much, Francis. Yes, it is a snowstorm outside. Finally, and to kind of bring it all home, please allow me to introduce Jason Dion, who was formerly with Canada's Ecofiscal Commission and who now serves as the Mitigation Research Director at the Canadian Institute for Climate Change. And Jason, you also are sharing your screen, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Got it.
Thank you, Jill, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Very happy to get the opportunity to present some of the work I've done on this topic to you. So just stand by while I share my screen. So I'm going to be talking about the specific financial assurance policy regime that exists in British Columbia. So we've heard a bit about it so far today, and I'm going to try to shed a little more light and also come at it from a bit of a different angle than we might have heard so far. So just a quick outline, I'll do a quick background on my work on this to date, talk about the two types of risk that David Chambers already alluded to. I'm going to walk through some of the specific types of financial assurance instruments and how we've broken it down, profile BC's current approach, and then make some recommendations for how that approach could be improved. So a background on my work on this topic. I'm the former lead researcher for Canada's Ecofiscal Commission, which was a group of policy-minded economists that came together to advocate for market-based solutions to environmental issues and challenges. So the core idea there being, when there's an environmental harm, you need to put a price on that so that the proponent of the group or individual causing that harm has an incentive to reduce it, that it's a market failure that causes a lot of pollution. So the big obvious example there is GHG emissions. So carbon pricing, a really strong focus of that organization, and a continuing focus in my current work as the Mitigation Research Director at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. But another topic that the Ecofiscal Commission took on was the idea of the risk of environmental damage and putting a price on that. So it was kind of a novel application of this idea that the Ecofiscal Commission was built around. So rather than pricing actual harm, pricing the potential for harm. So that's kind of my starting point in coming to this topic. Perhaps naively in the beginning, it was quite elegant on the whiteboard as an idea and turned into a bit of a rabbit hole. But the idea with this report, Responsible Risk, and it was a product of over a year of research from the Commission, was to look at risks to the environment from economic activity. So not kind of natural disasters, but man-made disasters. The scope of it was multi-sector, so looking at all sorts of different sectors, but with a deep dive on the mining sector in particular. And really looking quite closely at financial assurance as the way of pricing risk, of putting a price on that risk to the environment, and thereby creating an incentive to reduce it. So Ecofiscal Commission was a 5-year project that has since closed, but I've continued on this topic and specifically looking at British Columbia with some work being done under the banner of the First Nations Energy and Mining Council. So we've done a series of reports through them that was focused on the need for improved financial assurance policy, taking a close look at what it could look like for disasters, and most recently, a close look at what improved policy would look like for mine remediation. So that's the place that I'm coming to this topic from as an economist, as a representative of a group focused on dealing with environmental challenges through efficient market-based policy instruments. So David Chambers already talked about this, but I just want to sort of reiterate, we're really talking about two different categories of risk here in the mining sector. On the one hand, there is the possibility of disasters, obviously made kind of quite concrete and real by that Mount Poly spill. And on the other hand, there's the risk of mines not getting remediated at the end of their life, which can lead to things like acid mine drainage. So two very important environmental risks, but quite different in the way that they work and the way you'd want to tackle them through financial assurance policy. So Dr. Chambers also talked about this, but I just wanted to sort of elaborate that idea that these risks are different. So with remediation, you're expecting environmental harm. It's a matter of, through the normal course of operations of the mine, environmental harm is being done that you're seeking to clean up at the end. Whereas for a disaster, it's probabilistic. Harm may or may not occur in the form of a tailings dam breach. So quite different already in that regard. The severity of the costs is also quite different. It can really vary in terms of remediation, but disasters can be quite severe and catastrophic when they do occur. So we saw that with Mount Poly. There's also since been 2 tailings dam failures in Brazil that have been quite catastrophic in terms of environmental impact and also loss of human life. So in terms of the way these are dealt with in financial assurance policy in BC, as Dr. Chambers talked about, remediation is covered. So this is pretty standard. And if you go back decades, this wasn't necessarily the case in a lot of jurisdictions. Mines could simply set up shop and shut down and leave behind an environmental legacy. That's been addressed in large part with a mixed record, I think it's fair to say, as Dr. Chambers was talking about. The devil is in the details, the way that these instruments are calibrated, the specifics of the financial assurance requirements matter an awful lot. So that's why I have that asterisk on there, covered, and we'll get back to some of the shortcomings in BC, but at least covered. When it comes to the risk of mining disasters, it's completely uncovered. And it's a huge hole when you look at that possibility. It's not unusual, so it's pretty standard. So we did some work looking all across Canada in terms of the way these policies are dealt with in the mining sector. And usually this sort of financial assurance against the risk of a mining disaster is simply not required. And that makes it a really big outlier when it comes to other sectors that pose the risk of disaster. So again, Dr. Chambers did talk about this, but to be a bit more specific, tanker traffic, offshore drilling and extraction, nuclear energy, transport of dangerous goods by rail, and pipelines all are liable for damages of up to $1 billion and exceeding that in some cases. But that's not enough. They have to show that they have the means to actually address these costs, that bankruptcy won't be a reason for them not to be held financially responsible. And the way that that's dealt with in all those sectors is different. Some use an industry fund where the companies pay into it on an ongoing basis and it gets built up. Others pool their insurance coverage, their coverage with third parties. Some have to do bonding, or they have the potential to do a co-insurance scheme. So I'll get back to these specific instruments in a moment. But just to emphasize that while the way it's dealt with is different across sectors, it is dealt with in other sectors. And that makes this treatment of disasters in the mining sector a bit of an outlier. And it's a big issue. So let's talk about specific types of financial assurance. And this is, so there's tons more in our reports on this. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but just to map them out at a high level, that you can put them into 5 basic categories. But before we do that, let's start with a definition of financial assurance. And it's where we require firms to promise or commit funds against their environmental liabilities, whether those liabilities are expected ones or potential ones. And what you're guarding against here is the possibility of bankruptcy. And the reason why this is an important public policy problem is not only the financial risk that it presents, it's that when companies know there's a chance that someone else might pay for cleanup, they have less of an incentive to reduce the scale or severity of environmental damage. Now, economists call this problem moral hazard, and it's a big problem. It's a mismatch of incentives. And that's the reason that you ask for financial assurance. It's to recreate and re-solidify those incentives that could and should exist otherwise if it weren't for bankruptcy. So the possibility of a firm going bankrupt and not meeting its liabilities not only presents that financial risk to taxpayers, it also exacerbates the risk of environmental harm occurring in the first place. So when it comes to those specific types, you can break them down into these five categories. There's, on the one hand, hard firm level assurance. So this is stuff that cannot fluctuate in value, that the firm provides itself. Cash, bonds, these are different types of hard assurance. You can contrast that with softer forms of assurance. Here, what's being pledged can fluctuate in value. It might suddenly become unavailable. So it's not as reliable, but it includes things like pledges of assets, parent company guarantees. So these are a softer form of assurance. You can also have assurance provided by a third party. So where you contract an insurer or a bank to provide you letters of credit or insurance coverage. So it's handled by that external party, and the company pays premiums in exchange for that coverage. You can also do something similar through a sector level scheme, a public sector level scheme that's kind of quite broad in its coverage. So I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs of all of these. Happy to answer that in the Q&A, but just to map out that these are the high level categories that you really want to distinguish between. Now, what's interesting about financial assurance is policymakers that are crafting policy for it actually have three separate goals. They want deterrence. They want the company that is posing the environmental risk to have an incentive to reduce it. They want compensation so that there's coverage in the event of environmental harm, but they also want to facilitate economic activity. They don't want to create hurdles and financial costs that are too large and get in the way of productive economic activity. These goals pull against each other. And you can see that in this figure here. I'm not going to go through all the details, but you have those five categories of instruments and those three goals. And what you can see is there's no winner. There's no way to get it all across these instruments. You have to make trade-offs in the design of financial assurance. It comes with the territory. So what is BC's approach? What has BC adopted? So I'll start with the good news. The good news is that in BC, the Chief Inspector of Mines has really broad authority to require financial assurance from mining firms. No legislative change would be needed in order to do more. The authority's there. The province also has a polluter pay principle, a policy in place. So that legal foundation, the idea that the polluter should be held responsible is enshrined in legislation. In practice, though, the stringency of financial assurance requirements is pretty limited. And the Auditor General of BC has highlighted this. It's also not transparent. It can be a bit ad hoc. So in practice, the amount of financial assurance held relative to the liabilities is mismatched. So there are uncovered potential liabilities and existing liabilities in the form of cleanup remediation costs. This mismatch is mostly due to the province's practice of phasing in financial assurance requirements over the life of a mine. So rather than asking for it up front, they ask for more and more as the mine matures. The idea, and I've heard this from the regulators directly, is that the reserves are a form of assurance, that the mine as it's at its peak reserves in terms of what it holds, another company could take that over. The reserves themselves are a form of financial assurance. But you can see the trouble with that is that if those reserves decline in value, and another company is not willing to take it over, you don't have a guarantee of compensation. And you also have less deterrence because of that gap. So some important gaps there in BC's approach. So the big two findings are, when it comes to mine remediation in BC, there's no guarantee that the polluter will pay. And that reduces their incentives to avoid environmental harm. And if a Mount Polley like disaster were to occur in British Columbia again, and the responsible company was bankrupted, a large share of its costs would fall to the public. As bad as it was, Mount Polley was not a worst case scenario. If that company had gone bankrupt, there would have been no guarantee of compensation. And that's a really, really big hole that I think a lot of people don't understand exists. So I'm going to jump now to some of the recommendations we've made around how BC could improve its approach. And the recommendation there, so we'll do one for remediation, one for disasters. For remediation, the recommendation is that the province should require hard financial assurance, so assurance that can't fluctuate in value or suddenly become available, and require it both in full and upfront from mining companies. So some other presenters talked about Alaska's approach, where bonding is required in full, only hard types are accepted. It must be provided upfront, But what it does is only based on existing site disturbance. So not what will eventually happen at the mine site according to its plans, but what's in place now. Quebec, and so we've looked at a bunch of jurisdictions in Canada. Quebec is really kind of the gold standard when you look at different jurisdictions to compare to. Following a set of broader 2013 reforms, Quebec is requiring upfront, in full, hard financial assurance within 2 years of a mine commencing operations. So and that's based on all the disturbance that will occur over the entire lifetime of the mine. No distinction is made for financial risk. So a big, well-capitalized company has to provide the same capital as a smaller one. And that disturbance timelines exception isn't made either. Now, what's really interesting about Quebec is, this is the toughest, most stringent financial assurance policy in place in Canada. And, industry proponents might have sounded a warning alarm that this could really hurt mining investment. We've seen the opposite. Quebec has led the country in mining sector investment since its 2013 reforms. So the idea that a strong financial assurance regime is inconsistent with a thriving mining sector is actually disproved by Quebec's example. And so I think it's really the one that BC should aspire to in the design of its programs. To do so would be, and I've noted this at the bottom, consistent with its own stated polluter pay policy. So it would be really to live up to the spirit of that commitment. Now, very quickly, I'll just also finally walk through our recommendation for disasters. Now here, it's important to note that this is not like remediation where it's a matter of catching up to the standard of other jurisdictions. Very few jurisdictions actually do this at all. And so really you're asking for BC to kind of be a leader in this regard. And I think there's a strong case for doing so given the experience of Mount Polley in that jurisdiction. So what we recommend here is a tiered financial assurance scheme. So you would have a certain amount of coverage at the firm level to create those incentives directly for them to reduce the risk of environmental harm, but recognizing that a company individually is not going to be able to provide the full scope of coverage against a potential disaster that might guarantee compensation. So beyond this first tier, you could have third-party insurance kick in, perhaps beyond that sector level, then even a public scheme. Really, it's not a matter of a specific number of tiers, but the idea that you would have these escalating tiers that balance your deterrence and compensation goals. The strength of this sort of approach is it can be built piece by piece. So you can start with any one of those tiers and you have a system already that's better than what's in place today. So while there's the vision for what this could be in time, I think it's quite practical in that what you're really calling for is just some coverage of this completely uncovered environmental risk where you don't see this kind of gap when you look at other economic sectors. So that concludes the slides I had. I'll pull them down here. Happy to speak to them more in the Q&A, but back to the others for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. All right, folks, so we have about 5 minutes left, and I mentioned in the chat that there is a Q&A box to issue some questions you might have for the panelists. I have one in the queue, and Nikki, I think, was targeting this question towards some of the lawmakers who joined us previously, and considering that they are, on the floor voting and whatnot, I think that this is still an interesting question and could potentially be applied to what Jason and Dr. Dave have both spoke to regarding potential solutions towards pooled funding approaches. Nikki writes, after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, an international oil spill fund was created to deal with catastrophic accidents. She requests if there would be support from lawmakers to support collaborative Cascadia or West Coast fund leveraged from mining companies to provide assurance and compensation in the case of a tailings failure. And considering we don't have those lawmakers on, I'm curious, Jason and or Dr. Dave or other panelists would be interested in kind of taking what you've gleaned as it relates to working both with industry and regulators over the years to speak a bit more to the notion of a collaborative pooled fund.
Maybe I can just provide a quick reaction and then over to Dr. Chambers. So at least from where I sit, the potential is certainly there. The idea that you would want to pool together more broadly to provide coverage against these risks is a no-brainer. I mean, that's how insurance works in the first place. And you can do it any number of ways. You can have a fund that gets paid into and gets built up over time. You can have a commitment that a number of firms in a sector will cover each other's costs that they might not be able to handle past a certain threshold. You could look for the private sector to come in and provide an insurance scheme. So as I mentioned before, really anything would be an improvement from what's in place today. And any willing party when it comes to that broader pooling should be welcomed. And so that's also possible across jurisdictions within the mining sector, but then also within BC, you could do that pooling across economic sectors. And that's the idea with the US Super Fund, which has its shortcomings certainly, but that tries to package together very different economic sectors in terms of the environmental risks they present to be able to do that sort of broader pooling of risk. Not sure if Dr. Dave has anything to add.
I agree. And the only thing I would add is that the difficult thing is to establish what scale you need to do this on. I think it's probably obvious you can't do it on a provincial or a state level, but a national level or a UN level or an industry level. I think those are the start of the options.
I'll also quickly mention here that, part of the reason that you have that coverage in other sectors for disasters that you don't in mining is those other sectors that I mentioned are all federally regulated, especially when they cross provincial boundaries, things like pipelines. So this policy area has been addressed in federal policy in Canada. The fact that it's strictly provincial in Canada does make it a difficult sort of who's going to go first type of problem. There is a lot of scope and importance around a national bottom-up initiative of provinces coming together to put these kind of protections in place so that they're not competing with each other in a race to the bottom in terms of the coverage around these issues.
Thanks, you guys. And Jason, on that note, and to kind of wrap up with a last question, I know folks, we might be losing folks as we arrive at the hour, but on that note, have you heard interest from BC policymakers working towards these kind of financial assurance changes?
I think so. Following the Auditor General's report, they have pledged to take a second look at their policy for remediation. I think that's what they're focused on right now. I think this idea for disasters, coverage of disasters, is a bit more of a long game. I think it's a big ask, frankly, for BC to go beyond what others have done. So I think there's interest and curiosity. Do I suspect that they're actively, busily working away on this type of scheme that we've described here? I think not, but I think when the work on remediation is done, I think it should be a topic that they and other jurisdictions turn to, because the risks are real and they're not going away, as Dr. Chambers' work has noted globally.
Yeah, definitely. And I would add to that, their reclamation policy has been kind of a commitment over the course of NDP leadership the last few years, and was, included within the mandate in the recent October 2020 election. And I think we, through partners in BC, have gleaned that there is a continued delay in the release of an updated policy. And so I think, again, and the intent of this webinar in particular is to continue to raise awareness for this very complex international issue that does directly relate to the management of our wild salmon systems that are shared, or these shared resources. And I think that for those of us who are interested in working towards collaborative solutions, as Congressman Young alluded to, I think this opportunity for improved governance and reclamation remediation policies, and to ensure to not only British Columbians who are bear the burden of their taxes going towards cleanup for industry, I think to ensure that downstream communities have the ability to hold accountable these companies that have the potential to impact their ways of life, I think is really critical. So on that note, if there are final comments from panelists, please weigh in here. And I think we have one more question, maybe if folks don't mind. This is coming in from Juno. Are there any estimations about how much public money has been spent on remediation, litigation, and other efforts to get companies to take environmental impacts into consideration? That's a big question, Peter, but I think Jason and Dr. Dave might be able to allude to it. And we can certainly follow up with written comments as well.
Do you want to go first?
Well, I mentioned that just in terms of reclamation requirements, tens of millions of dollars of public money have already been spent on closing mines that didn't have adequate financial assurance for closure. And tens of millions of dollars have been spent to provide water treatment for water treatment that either wasn't provided for initially, or the financing that was provided wasn't adequate. So we're already talking some fairly big numbers.
Yeah, certainly agree. And the full scope of what you've described is a fascinating question in terms of everything that would include. And I think it would be massive. I don't know the number, and I think it would take some digging to figure it out. But I mean, you can just look at the giant mine in Northwest Territories, where the eventual cleanup of that is estimated to cost north of $1 billion. That's one mine. So we're talking about vast sums of money here. And a closing thought is that when I explain this in plain language to people, the idea is simply that, well, the mine knows it's going to create a mess it needs to clean up. This is a matter of just simply having confidence that they're going to be able to do that cleanup work. When you put it that simply to people, it does seem like a no-brainer. And these exceptions for, well, we're accounting for financial risk and the assumed value of the reserves. If the reserves are so valuable, if the financial risks are so low, then there shouldn't be a problem with asking for a bond from the company, as many other jurisdictions do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason and Dr. Dave. Francis or Councilman Erickson, any final remarks before we wrap up?
I'm good. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Jill, and I look forward to continuing dialogue.
Thank you, Francis.
Yep, nothing for me. I just appreciate you guys giving me the time to speak with all of you, and you guys have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
We appreciate you. Many thanks to all of our panelists, and for those of you who joined to be part of this dialogue and working towards international solutions. This webinar is recorded. We likely will have it shared on the Salmon Beyond Borders website, and or if you would like to reach out to me to get a recording or a copy of that recording to share with others who were not able to join, please reach out. Again, thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.